Hey class, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the big question, the biggest question, the most controversial topic in religion forever, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is the big question, and it's the thing that all other religions dispute, and it's the one thing that Christians cling to and hold on to as the truth that drives every other aspect of Christianity. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the reason someone becomes a Christian, because they believe it's true and because they choose to follow that Christ. We're going to talk about it today. In Thailand, 9,900 miles away from Arkansas, I served as a missionary. And I got into a discussion with a Thai lady, and I wanted to convince her of the Christian truth. And she looked at me and she said, "I do not believe that Jesus rose from the dead." This is a Buddhist lady, and that's what it comes down to. No matter what religion you are, if you're not a Christian, you can't believe that Jesus rose from the grave. If Jesus did rise from the grave, I mean, how could you argue that Jesus is God? How could you argue his divinity? The one who not even death could stop him, you could not argue that one's divinity. So we're going to talk about today the resurrection and why, as Christians, we can believe it's true and why it's rational, why it's logical, why it's the most probable. We believe, first of all, in a spiritual realm. That is what I want to make clear. And as Christians, one of the doctrines that we hold close is that there is a demonic realm. There are angelic beings. There are spiritual beings that are not God, but that were created by God. And many of those spiritual beings rebelled against God. We call them demons, and we call the father of them Satan, the deceiver, the trickster, Lucifer. So, if there is a spiritual realm, and if the spiritual realm has some of its spiritual beings that have indeed gone rogue, how do you think these spiritual beings would convince humans to disbelieve in Jesus and his resurrection? Well, simply, they would deny it happened. And this started immediately after the resurrection. We find this in Matthew's gospel account, and I'll read a portion from the 28th chapter. As the women were on their way, these women who had come to see Jesus and found from the angel that he was gone, that he had risen from the grave. As the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and told the leading priests what had happened. A meeting with the elders was called, and they decided to give the soldiers a large bribe. They told the soldiers, "You must say, 'Jesus' disciples came during the night while we were sleeping, and they stole his body. If the governor hears about it, he will stand up for you so you won't get into trouble.'" So the guards accepted the bribe and said what they were told to say. Their story spread widely among the Jews, and they still tell it today. So here we have Matthew, who's recalling or recording in the scriptures that we have today this account. So in the year 2021, 2,000 years after the fact, if there's a spiritual realm And if the spiritual realm has spiritual beings that have rebelled against God, how do you think today that those spiritual beings and Satan would try to move people away from the truth? Well, to move them away from the resurrection and to deny the validity of that. And how is he going to do that? By denying that this account that we have is valid. To say that the scriptures are not true. And this is what many try to prove to do, is they try to prove that the scriptures are old, the scriptures are unreliable, the scriptures were written long after the fact. And fortunately, we are privileged in our time and in our country to have scholars who are brilliant people that are going up against the philosophers and the atheists of this day. And today I want to introduce you to one of those. I was privileged to go to an evangelism conference 2 years ago. And I met a man named J. Warner Wallace. I want to tell you a little bit about J. Warner Wallace. And I want to grab a book off of my desk to introduce you to. I've read most of this book, and I'm using, as you'll see here in a minute, I'm using some of this book here in the lecture today. But J. Warner Wallace wrote this book. It's called Cold Case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective in Los Angeles. And for years, J. Warner Wallace was an atheist. He went to church with his wife against his will, and he was sitting there in the church service, and the preacher got up and started preaching and made a statement and said, "Jesus is the wisest man ever to live." And J. Warner Wallace said, "Yeah, I highly doubt that." But he wanted to prove him wrong. Something sat uneasy in his stomach, and he couldn't just deny it. He had to prove it. So he went to the bookstore after church, and he bought himself a Bible. And he began to read the 4 gospel accounts to disprove Christianity. As he tells in the beginning of this book, he laid on his bed one night, looking up at the ceiling. And his wife was wondering what was going through his mind. And he looked over at his wife and he said, "I think they're right. I think it's true." And J. Warner Wallace has become one of the most prominent apologists in the world today. I could not recommend this book any higher. At the end of this lecture, I'm going to leave a video that I want you to watch. It's a very short video. But it's J. Warner Wallace talks about why there's discrepancies in the 4 gospel account. Why are there differences? Why does one account of the gospels say that there was one angel at the tomb when Jesus rose from the grave, and another says that there was more than one? Why does one gospel account say that the soldier who was one of the ones who crucified Jesus, he said, "This man is innocent"? And the other gospel account records this soldier saying, "This man is the Son of God. Truly, this man is the Son of God." Why are there differences in the 4 gospel accounts? He explains it beautifully, but I want you to watch that video. What I want to do in this class is I want to talk about the 11 pieces of circumstantial evidence that makes it probable that the New Testament writings took place in the 1st century. This is crucial when we talk about apologetics. Were the New Testament writings, and specifically the 4 gospel accounts, were they written in the 1st century or were they written in the 2nd and 3rd century? Why is that important? Well, as J. Warner Wallace describes in this book, if he's investigating a case, he wants to know if the person is an eyewitness. Were they there? Did they see it? Or is it long after the fact? So let's talk about 11 pieces of circumstantial evidence that makes it probable that the New Testament writings took place in the first century. Number one, the New Testament fails to describe the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, I have on my bookshelf over there all of the writings of Josephus. Who is Josephus? Well, Josephus is a name that you need to know, if you're a Christian especially, and Josephus was not a Christian. Josephus was a Jew. He followed Judaism. He did not believe in Christianity. He did not believe in Christ. So he was a non-believer, but he was a historian during the first century. And so much of what we learn about the first century, we learn from Josephus. Also, we learn a lot about the first century from the New Testament, but we can take the New Testament and we can take Josephus' writings, and Josephus' writings can help us understand the New Testament so much more in the historical context. One of the things we learn from Josephus, who lived long after 70 AD, but during 70 AD, is we learn about the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. And this happened in 70 AD. We do not find anything about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, certainly, had the four gospel accounts and had the New Testament been written after 70 AD, we would have found something about it in there. Certainly, they would have mentioned that, but they do not. Number two, the New Testament fails to describe the siege of Jerusalem, which happened before the destruction of the temple. So before the temple was destroyed, the Roman Empire destroyed all of Jerusalem and eventually the temple, but first their battle and their siege of Jerusalem. So we have the siege of Jerusalem, we have the destruction of the temple. None of this is mentioned in the New Testament, which just these 2 points alone help us to see that the New Testament was most likely written before 70 AD. Number three, Luke said nothing about the deaths of Paul and Peter. Now, Paul was martyred in 64 AD in Rome, and Peter was martyred in 65 AD. Paul and Peter were two key figures in Christianity. So when you think of the New Testament, you have to think of Paul. Paul is one of the most key figures in the New Testament. And also you have to think of Peter. Peter was the one who Jesus Christ himself handed the keys to. And upon Peter, Jesus Christ began to build his church. Okay, so to not mention Paul and Peter, to not mention their death, would have certainly been, it's just unrealistic that not one of the New Testament writers would have mentioned the death of Paul and the death of Peter. And yet these are not mentioned in the four gospel accounts. So we're talking about the time period of the New Testament, but we're specifically talking about the four gospel accounts because it would have been the four gospel accounts that really highlight the resurrection. Now, Paul talks about it in his writings as well, but when were the gospel accounts written? Some who are liberal theologians, they are not believers in the resurrection. They would say that the gospel accounts were written long after 100 AD. And Christian scholars strongly disagree with that, and I believe have very good proof to disagree with that. Number four, Luke said nothing about the death of James. James was martyred in 62 AD in Jerusalem. He was the leader of the mother church. Now, why is Luke important? Well, Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and also wrote Acts, the Acts of the Apostles as they were led by the Holy Spirit. So Luke is the thing, in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke's Gospel account, we find the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. In Acts, we find the things that Jesus continued to do and teach through his apostles, okay? So this is an account from Luke to Acts. It's kind of like a two-phase account of starting with the birth of Jesus and going all the way through the early church, and yet nowhere in that account is it mentioned that James was martyred, and that was in 62 AD. So that would lead us to believe that Luke and Acts were written before 62 AD. Number 5, Luke's gospel predates the book of Acts. So we're talking about when the gospel accounts were written. So one of those gospel accounts is Luke. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Luke was written before Acts was written. How do we know that? Well, the introduction of both of these books, Luke and Acts, tie themselves together, stating Acts is the continuation of what Luke wrote earlier. So we know that the Gospel of Luke happened before, or was written before, the Acts account. Number 6, Paul quoted Luke's Gospel in his letter to Timothy. So the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to Timothy. Now, why is this noteworthy that Paul quoted from the Gospel of Luke? Here's why it's noteworthy. It's more difficult to date the Gospels, to say when they were written, than it is to date Paul's letters, Paul's epistles. Why is that? Because Paul was the author. So it would have had to be during Paul's lifetime. And who did Paul write to? Well, Paul wrote to churches. He wrote Romans, Corinthians, 1st and 2nd, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. And then, so those 6 are written to churches within those cities. And then he wrote letters to individuals. He wrote Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy. He wrote the letter to Titus. He wrote the letter to Philemon. And there's debate on whether or not Paul wrote Hebrews. I don't believe he did. But the point is, these letters to the churches and to individuals were certainly written by Paul. There's little dispute that Paul wrote those letters. Very little dispute. Well, Paul quotes from the Gospel of Luke. And so how could he have quoted from the Gospel of Luke if Luke came after 1st and 2nd Timothy? It's impossible. And what I think J. Warner Wallace has done in this book is so brilliant, because it takes one of the attacks from non-believers on the scriptures, and it just refutes it. And I think it does it brilliantly. Number 6, Paul quoted Luke's gospel. Paul quoted Luke's gospel in his letter to Timothy. Number 7, Paul echoed the claims of the gospel writers. This is important because the epistles are much easier to date, since the author, Paul, and the audience, many of them, are clear. And we said that earlier. So not only did Paul quote from Luke's gospel, but he echoes the claims of the gospel writers. So not only do we find the resurrection of Jesus Christ in the Gospels, but we find it in Paul's letters as well. Paul does not contradict the gospel writers. No, he does much more than Paul does. He doesn't contradict them, but he does more than just verify. He supports everything that they said, and he makes it even. He even takes it further and explains what's going on. When excuse me, when you read Paul's writings, not only does he verify what the gospel authors wrote, but he ties together the story of the Bible. He quotes constantly from the Old Testament. The Apostle Paul quotes from the book of Isaiah more than he quotes from any other Old Testament book. But he quotes from the Psalms, he quotes from the book of the books of Moses, the Torah, and he ties it all together. And Paul does this in his letters. Number 8, Paul quoted Luke's gospel in his letter to the Corinthians. So not only did Paul quote Luke's gospel in his letter to Timothy, but he quotes it in his letter to the Corinthians. Let's see here. Number 9, Luke quoted Mark and Matthew repeatedly. When we read the first 4 verses of Luke, we see that he was a historian. He gathered information. Let me go quickly to Luke chapter 1, and I want to read to you the first 4 verses. Listen carefully. This is what Luke writes. Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also had decided to write a careful account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught. So, not to get too much into Theophilus, but Theophilus, we don't know who he was. Some have argued that there was someone in 200 AD who was named Theophilus, and therefore the Gospel of Luke was written in 200 AD. It's just a very weak argument. I mean, who's to say there wasn't someone in 200 AD named Theophilus and someone during the time of Luke whose name was Theophilus? But the point is, whoever Theophilus was, he had commissioned Luke, probably paid him a handsome fee, to write this account to see and to gather information to see if what he was told was true. So it went something like this. Theophilus goes to Luke, who is a historian and a doctor as well, and says, Luke, I'm going to pay you to investigate. And I want you to go out and I want you to gather information so that I can know whether or not the things I've heard are true. So, what did Luke do? In verse 2, he says they used the many accounts that have been written. These people used eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Then Luke says, me, having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I have decided to write this account for you. Okay, so Luke goes around and gathers evidence from eyewitness accounts. So he goes up to a lady and he says, were you there at the death of Jesus? Tell me what happened. And he's gathering all this information. So Luke quoted in his gospel account from Mark and from Matthew repeatedly. So 2 of Luke's sources were the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. Number 10, Mark's Gospel appears to be an early crime broadcast, J. Warner Wallace says. A crime broadcast is an early report sent out across the air by the dispatcher to alert those in the area of a crime. So Mark's Gospel account was the first Gospel account, and it appears to be a crime broadcast. What this means is that the details, the nitty-gritty details, are left out of it. It's the first gospel. It's a quick gospel that's written, and much of the details are left out of it. That's number 10. Number 11, Mark appears to be protecting key players. So, for example, in Mark 14, we read Mark's account of the events that happened just prior to Christ's death, when one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now, John Mark does not tell us who it was that struck off the ear. Why? Well, it would make sense that he was protecting this individual. Years later, the last gospel account was written by the Apostle John, and John names these people. John not only names Peter as the one who smacked off his ear, but he also names the person whose ear was knocked off, okay? So Mark does not give their names, John does give their names, and J. Warner Wallace, by the way, he's not the only one. Many, many Christian theologians and historians believe that Mark was protecting them. So those are the 11 pieces of circumstantial evidence that makes it probable that the New Testament writings took place in the first century. Also note two things. Number one, the destruction of the temple is not detailed, but it is predicted in the gospel accounts. So we call this the Olivet Discourse. And there are actually Christians who disagree on the meaning of the Olivet Discourse. And you'll hear Christians debating on whether the Olivet Discourse is talking about the end times or whether it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Most Christian scholars, and I say most, believe that the Olivet Discourse is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. He predicts the destruction of the temple. But so even though we don't have the details of the destruction because it was written before it, we do have Jesus' prediction. Also, I want you to note the non-believing Jewish historian, and I mentioned this at the beginning of class, the non-believing Jewish historian Josephus, as one of the most relied upon historians for Christian scholars over the years. His writings have increased the validity of the scriptures, not contradicted them. And so, obviously, Josephus' writings are not scripture. He's just a historian. But fortunately for Christians, and this gives us good reason to believe that the scriptures are true, although we don't hang our faith on what a historian said, but Josephus is a very reputable historian, even amongst non-believers. And what he wrote does not contradict the scriptures. So, J. Warner Wallace, look him up on YouTube. I really want to recommend him to you, along with some other resources that I'll recommend to you this semester. But he has helped me so much answer some of these difficult questions about the validity of the gospel accounts, the contradictions within the gospel accounts. Oh, it's been so helpful. So I want to recommend him to you. All right.